The early 2000s, a time when bookshelves were overflowing with magic, chosen ones, and at least 3 different Harry Potter knockoffs per bookstore aisle. Now, some of these fantasy series have become household names, others have vanished without a trace, and a few lingered in a weird in-between space, never quite getting their due. Now, this brings us to the incredible Spiderwick Chronicles. Now, it may not have been a blockbuster juggernaut or as ubiquitous as something like Animorphs, but it definitely wasn't exactly obscure either. In fact, you've probably heard of it. Maybe you saw the 2008 movie, maybe you caught wind of the recent Disney Plus series and have opinions on it, or maybe you're one of the lucky ones who got to experience the books in all their beautifully illustrated glory in a series that combines powerful messages about the struggles of growing up, some actually pretty dark moments, and some really great world building fleshed out with some of the most incredible artwork for a series like this. But here's the thing, Spiderwick has had a surprisingly bumpy ride over the years, and it never reached the towering heights of some of its fantasy peers, but it definitely hasn't been forgotten either. So, in this video, I'm going to explain what this series is all about, the many highs and lows of its adaptations, and finally where everything is at today to explore whatever happened to the Spiderwick Chronicles. Hi everyone, my name is Otto, and welcome to Exits Examined. We will be exploring series, franchises, and more after their prime time has seemingly come to an end. If that sounds good to you, there's a like and subscribe button below, and I want to give an enormous shout out to my patrons who make this channel possible. You guys seriously rock. So, the Spiderwick Chronicles, written by Holly Black and illustrator Tony DiTerlizzi. The series sold over 20 million copies, which is definitely nothing to sneeze at, and kids of the time definitely knew about it. But considering how few books there actually were in the series, pound for pound, they hit way above their weight. So, what's it about? Well, on the surface, it's pretty straightforward. 3 siblings, twins Jared and Simon, and their older sister Mallory move into the mysterious, slightly dilapidated Spiderwick estate, where they discover a hidden world of fairies, goblins, and magical creatures. It's this classic 2000s recipe, a secret magical world, gothic vibes, and a sense that everything is way darker than it initially seems. And make no mistake, this series actually does get downright unsettling at times. Now, the world of fairies and magical creatures is really what makes Spiderwick stand out. After all, that's what it's all about. But if you're thinking, oh, fairies, cute little Tinkerbell, then I have some bad news for you, because no, you do not want to trust these little freaks. I remember reading these as a kid and assuming that the fairies would just be these misunderstood little guys who wouldn't actually hurt anyone, but nope, wrong. These fairies will lie to you, manipulate you, and that's just if you're lucky. Sure, some of them might help you, but only if it serves their own little twisted fairy agendas. Make no mistake, these fairies are mercenaries. But that's kind of the brilliance of Spiderwick. It wraps itself in this gothic fairy tale aesthetic that seems cozy on the surface, but underneath it there is this constant tension, like kidnapping, disappearances, and family breakdowns. Jared and his siblings aren't just fighting off goblins and mildly inconvenient pixies, the threats feel real. There's this constant sense of paranoia and some surprisingly heavy themes like absent parents, anger issues, family trauma, and even in the sequel series, there's a scene where a family house burns to the ground and a really hard scene where the family is seen picking through the wreckage. And if you've ever seen, or worse, experienced a house fire, you know how deeply unsettling that is. Now, DiTerlizzi once said that kids don't want their fairy tale sugar-coated, they want a little grit, and Spiderwick absolutely delivers on that, with in one book a whole lot of dwarves getting slaughtered, and on a reread, honestly when I was going through this, sometimes I found myself wondering if this series is actually about troubled kids trying to escape their issues, more than it is about magical creatures. But let's back up a minute before I get ahead of myself. So what actually is the story here? Alright, so like I mentioned, we got 3 kids, Jared, Simon, and Mallory Grace, moving into a massive crumbling old house with their mom because, surprise, surprise, their parents are going through a divorce, and right from the jump, things are not looking great for Jared. He's volatile, angry, and generally one bad day away from flipping a table, and of course, cue mysterious happenings. Things start breaking, weird stuff happens left and right throughout the house, and naturally, Jared, already labeled the troubled one, gets blamed for all of it. But the real culprit is a tiny little gremlin named Thimbletack, who used to be be a helpful brownie before things went sideways. Now, during all of this, Jared finds an old book hidden in the house, Arthur Spiderwick's Field Guide to the Fantastical World Around You, which is a pretty self-explanatory title, but is an enormous book detailing the invisible world, which is basically the home to the fairy people and many other creatures like goblins and merpeople. Now, most humans lack the ability to see the invisible world, but those who have the sight can. And eventually, with knowledge gained from the field guide, the Grace children eventually get the sight. Now, as I mentioned, some of these creatures are friendly, but others most definitely are not. But of course, when Jared tries to tell anyone about it, they just assume he's acting out because, again, divorced kid. But before we go forward, let's break down the siblings. We got Jared, who, as I mentioned, is impulsive, but also the one asking the big questions and pushing the story forward. We also got Simon, who is the chill twin, who basically loves animals, is empathetic, and thinking. And finally, we got Mallory, the classic older sibling who gives off major I don't have time for this energy, but also she's a fencer and a very good one at that, which you can bet comes in handy against all these rude fairies. And if anything even looks at her brothers funny, she is fully prepared to stab first and ask questions later. Okay, so going back to the boy who cried fairy situation, these siblings eventually come together, learn more about the magical world surrounding them, and more importantly, realize that keeping Arthur Spiderwick's book might not be a good idea, because now a whole host of creatures, including the big bad of the series, the ogre Mulgarath, wants it, and that sets the stage for pretty much everything that happens in the series. Now, at its core, the Spiderwick Chronicles isn't just about fairy hijinks. It's also a story about family, trust, and dealing with some very real struggles. It's also important to note that these stories are not formulaic. Each book, something different happens and pushes the plot forward, as opposed to other book series at the time, which tended to be more structured or episodic. Now, let's be real. If you're looking for a wildly intricate, groundbreaking plot, this might not be it. Although the overall story is fun, the real strength of the series isn't in the twists and turns, it's in the world itself. And the entire thing is just an excuse for the Grace children, and by extension the reader, to find new facets of this admittedly awesome world. And the world here is great. From the very first page, the book opens with a typed up note signed by Holly Black explaining that she and Tony had received a package from the Grace children and that everything inside was real. It's a clever little touch that immediately blurs the line between fiction and reality, and definitely gives series of unfortunate events vibes. And where the books truly shine is this intricate, lovingly crafted details of the fairy world. Elves are obsessed with circular dances, river trolls are masters of wordplay, and dwarves can literally disguise themselves as tree stumps. In a genre overflowing with well-worn fairy tale tropes, you can tell that Black and DiTerlizzi were determined to make this world feel unique and put their own personal spin on the folklore we all know and love. And what really elevates not just the world building, but the entire series to something truly special and unique are the illustrations, which are things of absolute beauty. Nearly every page features DiTerlizzi's stunning artwork, and I can't overstate enough how much they elevate the experience. Portraits, action scenes, even the way text is formatted, it all comes together, and you can feel that this was a true 50-50 partnership between an author and an illustrator, with the visuals being just as crucial to the storytelling as the words themselves. And speaking of that, the entire Spiderwick Chronicles experience, like the packaging itself, is dripping with gothic charm. From these really unique font choices to intricate maps of the Spiderwick estate within the books, you can tell everything was thought out and a labor of love. And the details don't stop at the artwork. At the end of each book, there are little rhymes and illustrations foreshadowing what's going to come next. Newspaper clippings, letters, maps, it all helped sell the illusion, and this actually even bled into the real world, with DiTerlizzi and Black being so committed to the realness of Spiderwick that when they did interviews like the one with Nickelodeon, they fully played along, acting like the books were actual historical accounts, so all great stuff. Now, if DiTerlizzi's name sounds familiar, it's probably because I talked about him before, but in a totally different video for something completely different within the context of D&D. Now, if you know what I'm talking about, I absolutely love you, but if you don't, that's okay too, because if you've ever seen the original D&D Planescape artwork, then you actually are familiar with DiTerlizzi's work. Now, even if you're not into D&D, I highly recommend checking out his work for Planescape. His vision was a huge part of what made the setting one of the most beloved within D&D history, and there are actually a lot of visual similarities between his work from Planescape and Spiderwick. Now, going back to Spiderwick, he wanted the illustrations to feel as real and detailed as possible. So he took a very methodical approach, and he said in interviews that a huge inspiration wasn't fairies at all, but actually naturalist illustrations like the works of John James Audubon, who, as a minor segue, did some incredible paintings of American birds. And I'm in no way a bird person, but these really are great. Speaking of this, the entire idea to do Spiderwick basically came from to do an Audubon-esque field guide to fairies, trolls, and goblins. And his goal was to make each fairy creature feel like it could actually exist. So he used the same tools as classical illustrators and studied animals for understanding on how these fairies would actually work. And some of these illustrations took weeks to complete, with a lot of the more intricate ones like the griffin and mermaid requiring a ton of time to get the textures of feathers and scales just right. He even kept detailed notes on how these creatures moved or sound, so it really is no wonder why the world of Spiderwick felt so organic and alive. And Holly Black, for her part, was brought in to flesh out the story, and honestly, it was seemingly a match made in heaven, and the series was way more successful than they ever expected. So speaking of that, what actually makes up the Spiderwick Chronicles, as in the books, not the adaptations? Well, this isn't some endless godforsaken black hole of a franchise, cough cough looking at you Dragonlance and Warrior Cats. Honestly, it's one of the most manageable series of its kind, and it doesn't demand a multi-year commitment to finish. In fact, you could honestly knock it out in a weekend if you really wanted to. So to start off, we got the Spiderwick Chronicles. Starting in 2003, it's a 5-book series following the Grace Children as they uncover the hidden world of the fairies. These ones are lightning fast paced, beautifully illustrated, and honestly just a great introduction to fantasy for younger readers. Now, as far as the books themselves, there was also a 2009 version which basically smashed them all together, and this was called the Completely Fantastical Edition. It also had nearly 100 extra pages, including a ton of additional artwork, as well as a 30-plus page sketchbook showcasing some of the early developmental work that helped shape the world of Spiderwick. Now, if that seems too short of a series for you, well, you would be right. And there actually were a handful more around the time of the Spiderwick movie, which don't worry, we'll talk about later. So these were beyond the Spiderwick Chronicles, starting in 2007, and they were a follow-up trilogy that shifts the focus to a new set of siblings who stumble upon their own fairy-related chaos. Now, sometimes when a franchise expands, especially when it does it at the same time as a movie, it can feel like a forced cash grab, but in interviews, DiTerlizzi admits he was hesitant at first because he wasn't sure if they could capture the same lightning in a bottle as the first series. It actually wasn't until Holly Black and him went on a trip to Florida for research that things really started to click together. So while it's a separate storyline, it still ties into the original books with some familiar faces popping up. You don't have to read the first series, but it definitely does enhance the experience. Now, the one thing about both of these series is that the books are short. The books themselves are about 100 pages each, and you could go through everything in a few days. And honestly, that's kind of refreshing because some series do drag on, and it is kind of nice to have such a cohesive and concise series. And this is no coincidence because, in the words of DiTerlizzi, quote, "I take comfort in the fact that we concluded on a high note with plenty of titles to enjoy, but not so many that the specialness of the series became diluted." End quote. Now, if you're the kind of person who likes the world building and lore more than the actual plot, then the Spiderwick Chronicles has some of the best companion books out there. Seriously, some of these might even be more up your alley than the main series itself, because the amount of care and artistry put into them is just next level, and I cannot overstate how much texture they add to the world. Starting, of course, with Arthur Spiderwick's Field Guide to the Fantastical World Around You. Now, I'm a huge sucker for in-universe companion books, and this is it. It's filled to the brim with fairy species, observations, and notes, and of course the art is absolutely gorgeous. Like, I cannot overstate that enough, how incredible some of these full-color detailed drawings are, with DiTerlizzi's skills just being on full display. And this is no coincidence because this was actually the book in many ways he wanted to write all along. There's so many immaculate details and practical tidbits like how to protect yourself from fairies, because let's be honest, they're not not exactly friendly, and also useful items to have prepared before going on an expedition to find magical creatures, like taking a thermos filled with milk to appease those angry fairies. Anyway, it really is just a real work of art, and if you're a fan of the setting, I can't recommend it enough. We also got the Spiderwick Chronicles notebook for fantastical observations in 2005, and this one was an interactive journal with short stories, mini adventures, maps, and space for readers to jot down their own fairy encounters. It's basically an in-universe activity book, and again, really tastefully done. On another note, we also got the Care and Feeding of Sprites in 2006, which is exactly what it sounds like. If you want to make a fairy as a pet, which by the way the books do not recommend, this is the one for you. And get used to me saying this, it's beautifully illustrated, complete with species descriptions and fold-out posters of different types. Now finally, we got the Chronicles of Spiderwick, a grand tour of the enchanted world, navigated by Thimbletack in 2007, and this one is basically a scrapbook-style deep dive into the Spiderwick universe, and I was blown away by the level of detail and just cool stuff going on here. Now, I've personally never really seen a book like this. It's packed with newspaper clippings, letters, maps, and diaries from characters like Mallory, Jared, and Arthur himself, and it feels totally in-universe. There are even riddles and interactive elements to make it feel like you're uncovering secrets alongside the characters. And while it mostly does stick to the fun, fantastical side of things, it does touch on some of the darker aspects of the story, like Arthur's disappearance and Jared's trouble at school. So while the Spiderwick Chronicles isn't a massive franchise, it has a ton of depth and options, and it all feels so cohesive and mindful. So if all this talk has you feeling a little overwhelmed, let me cheer you up with something that's guaranteed to make anyone happy. Stickers. Seriously, who doesn't love stickers? And better yet, handcrafted, beautifully designed stickers of animals and cryptids by independent artists. Well, that's where CatBug comes in. Every month they create new sticker designs and mail them out to subscribers worldwide. They're inspired by mythical creatures and folklore, and the art draws from mythology, storytelling, with designs that range from delightfully creepy to downright gorgeous. And my personal favorite is a cute little kitsune that looks amazing on just about anything. They even host polls sometimes so you can help decide future designs. And the best part is that it's super affordable. For just $4 a month, you get exclusive stickers mailed straight to your door, making them perfect for gifting. I'm really excited to support these folks. So use the code below, treat yourself or a friend, and support small artists while getting some seriously lovely stickers. So the books were a hit, full of eerie illustrations, mysterious creatures, and a surprisingly dark edge for a kid's series. And of course, Hollywood wanted in, and thus began the Spiderwick Chronicles journey through the wonderful ups and downs of adaptations, starting with the 2008 movie. Now, I'll be honest, I kind of forgot Nickelodeon even made movies, but back in the mid-2000s, they were actually putting out some solid stuff. And one of these movies was the Spiderwick Chronicles, and as a standalone film, it's pretty good. The casting was solid, the creature designs were fantastic, and the house was just chef's kiss, a perfect translation of that eerie yet intriguing feel from the books. But of course, if we're looking at it from an in-adaptation point of view, there were some changes, some understandable and some a little heartbreaking. They completely left out the fourth book and entire groups of creatures like the elves. And while the books leaned into a slightly more gothic tone, the movie felt softened a bit. That being said, they totally nailed the design of Mulgarath, and Freddie Highmore's dual performance as both Jared and Simon definitely got a lot of praise too. Also, fun fact, the actress who played Mallory had to go through 5 weeks of intense fencing training with the Canadian Olympic coach, so yeah, she wasn't just swinging swords around randomly. Now, one of the most surprising things about this adaptation is that instead of trying to drag out the books with a 1 movie per book approach, which is way too common, they went the opposite direction and condensed all 5 books into a single film. And somehow it actually worked. The movie flows pretty well despite the compression, which is impressive considering how much material they had to cram in there. Sure, some things had to be cut, but as far as book to movie adaptations go, this one definitely is not the worst thing that could ever have happened. And if you're more curious about this, there's also an official movie companion book that has some behind the scenes stuff, cast interviews, and photos, which is a neat little time capsule if you were super into the movie. Now, if the movie wasn't enough for you, we also got the mandatory tie-in video game. And look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend like it was some hidden masterpiece, but for a movie tie-in game, it honestly wasn't that bad. The graphics were decent for the time, and it followed the aesthetic of the film pretty closely, even including clips from it. You could explore the Spiderwick house, and it even had a gamified version of the field guide, which was a cool touch. The gameplay wasn't anything groundbreaking, but the atmosphere was spot on, and the music was surprisingly solid for bits too, and it really leaned into that mysterious, otherworldly vibe. Now, speaking of tie-ins, you best believe we are not nearly done yet. Oh no, we got puzzles and even an official board game called the Fantastical Field Guide Mystery Game, as well as a card game. Now, I have never played these, and despite my best efforts, I couldn't even track down anyone who has, and if you have played them, I'd be genuinely curious how these were to actually play, because I saw no reviews for the card game out there. But from what I've seen online, the board game looks surprisingly legit. The board itself is beautifully designed, complete with a pop-up Spiderwick mansion. The game has one player controlling the goblins, while the others play as the Grace Kids, and honestly, it looks fun. Now, if I ever find someone in real life who not only remembers the Spiderwick Chronicles, but is also up to play the board game with me, that would be an absolute miracle. And although the movie and the tie-in were successful financially, earning a significant amount of revenue, well, for years, it seemed like that was it for the series. But then, out of almost nowhere, in 2021, it was announced that a TV adaptation was in development for Disney+, and things did at first look promising, but with the good came the bad, because one of the major stated goals was to make the story resonate with modern audiences, which, yeah, is always kind of a bit of a red flag. Now, right out of the gate, the show made some wild changes. They threw in a metric ton of original characters, and suddenly we had plot lines that had absolutely nothing to do with the books. Like, I'm sorry, the blind swordmaster scene was just absolute insanity, and the whole thing felt like someone took the Spiderwick Chronicles and gave it the Artemis Fowl 2020 treatment. Same general coding if you squint really hard, but none of the actual substance. Now, to be fair, some of the changes were made with the blessing of the authors, and they wanted to expand some of the characters' backstory. But by the time you hit the last episode, it's literally an entirely different story, with a different finale, different plot lines, and yeah, I guess you could say that the show did sort of improve as it went along, but it was a pretty far cry from what fans expected, because call me crazy, I think fans just expected, a faithful adaptation of the book. Now, things started pretty rocky when Disney pulled the plug on the show before it even started airing, meaning the Spiderwick Chronicles was left stranded in limbo. That is until the Roku channel swooped in and rescued it, but even with a second chance, the show struggled. A lot of fans were disappointed, saying it felt more like a teen drama than the book series they knew and loved. And what made these books so good were the incredible creature designs and fleshed out worlds, but in the show, the creatures were barely on screen, and the magic of the world felt really watered down, and the overall story took so many liberties that it barely resembled the books anymore. As of now, it's unclear whether we'll get a second season, and honestly, that might not be the worst thing. But speaking of these, if you want a great in-depth breakdown of the movie and the TV show, I would highly recommend checking out the Uncultured Nerds videos. They have great takes on these, and I'll link these below for those who are interested. But hey, if all this adaptation drama has got you feeling down, I do have some good news, because the Spiderwick Chronicle audiobooks are flawless. Not only are they great adaptations of the books, but they're narrated by none other than Mark Hamill. Yes, Luke Skywalker himself is reading you the adventure of the Grace Kids, and honestly, what more could you ask for? So while the Spiderwick Chronicles has had a bit of a rough time in the adaptation department, at least the books and the audiobooks will always be there for us, and who knows, maybe one day we'll get other adaptations. I do think there is room here for a really cool animated adaptation, or maybe something like a nuanced video game. I don't know, call me crazy here, but my mind immediately went to something like Inscription, which would really suit the setting. So what does the future hold for the Spiderwick Chronicles? Well, that's a tricky one. The last new book in the series was published years ago, and while we did get some gorgeous 20th anniversary editions, including Arthur Spiderwick's Field Guide to the Fantastical Worlds Around You with newly discovered material, there hasn't really been much in the way of fresh content. The biggest recent development was, of course, the ill-fated Disney Plus series. Now, with its lukewarm reception, combined with the uncertainty over a second season, doesn't exactly scream bright future. But if the show does manage to turn things around and attract a bigger audience, it could usher in a new wave of fans, which would be incredible. As for Black and DiTerlizzi and what they've been up to, both are incredibly prolific authors authors with their own careers and projects. But aside from the anniversary editions, they haven't mentioned about new Spiderwick anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that the series is fading into obscurity. Because even if we don't get new books, we do have new stories just from the fans themselves. Fanfiction, artwork, and nostalgia-fueled discussions keep Spiderwick alive in its own way, although finding online spaces was a bit of a challenge. There is a wiki but no admin, and I couldn't even post on the Spiderwick Reddit, so thank you Spiderwick Reddit mods for that, but hopefully others' experiences online have been better. Granted, the fandom isn't as massive as other YA juggernauts, but the very fact alone that there was enough interest in 2024 to warrant an entire TV show says a lot about its staying power. But the question is why? Why has Spiderwick endured while so many other mid-2000s fantasy series have faded into the mist? Now, obviously the answer is different for everyone, but I think at its core, Spiderwick wasn't just about fairies and goblins, it was about childhood, imagination, and the messy, sometimes painful process of growing up. It was grounded in something much more intimate. 3 kids dealing with divorce, navigating sibling dynamics, and stumbling into a world of hidden dangers right in their backyard. And in that way, there was something almost believable about the magic in Spiderwick. Then there's the tone. Spiderwick never talked down to its audience. The monsters were actually scary, and the consequences of interacting with them weren't brushed aside. There was a real sense that the fairy world wasn't just fun and whimsical, it was downright dangerous. And of course, there's the art. The illustrations are probably what truly set Spiderwick apart. The intricate, almost scientific renderings of fairies, goblins, and trolls gave the series an identity no amount of descriptive text ever could. You didn't just read about these creatures, you saw them, studied them, and believed that they could exist. It was like leafing through an actual field guide, and that extra layer of immersion really made the world feel alive. So in the end, maybe Spiderwick doesn't need an endless stream of sequels or a massive fandom to stay relevant. It carved out its own niche, dark, whimsical, and beautifully strange. So in conclusion, what can I say? If you ever find yourself searching for those mercenary fairies for the love of all that is good, don't forget to bring your thermos filled with milk, because you'll definitely need it to appease those angry little guys. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate all the help and support. I want to give one more huge shout out to the Uncultured Nerd for helping me fact check and just being a great resource for the Spiderwick series. No shout out is ever complete without shouting out my incredible patrons. You guys are truly amazing, and I couldn't do this channel without you. Thank you. If you want to find out more ways to support me, you can check out my Patreon link in the description below. And of course, as always, if you ever have any suggestions about what you want me to cover next, please drop a comment. It's always really interesting to hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, thanks again. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.